Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb again. In part three of the Civil Rights Movement session, I want to focus on individuals and various groups that make up the social movements. So, what we have in 1964, we begin to see a change in the movement. It's moving in a direction that is getting away from some of the earlier uh, views of Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolence and the civil disobedience. There's a degree of frustration out there by 1964 that change is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. There needs to be more action to it. Plus, it seems like the gains that were happening uh, in the civil rights movement were addressing some of the issues that you found in uh, the southern region of the United States. But once you got out of the South, there are other issues that needed to be taken into consideration here. Issues like housing and jobs and treatment by the police here. And so you can see the urban frustrations being expressed. Poor urban communities were continuing to get worse, and so we have that inequality that's happening. Uh, as we begin to take down perhaps de jure segregation by law, de facto segregation was still existed in many of the northern cities and western cities, eastern cities as well, and that needs to be taken on as well. And the approach uh, to that can be through legislation, but more confrontation seems to be part of that as well. So those urban frustrations can be seen in examples of some urban riots, like in Watts riot, 1965, and in 1967 in Detroit. Lyndon Johnson puts together the Kerner Commission, and the Kerner Commission comes back and saying through all the efforts, through all the legislation, through the Great Society and war on poverty, America still is divided. And so more measures need to be put in place. Martin Luther King Jr. is beginning to try to reach out and expand the civil rights movement and take on some of these issues. And so when he went to Chicago and he lived on the south side of Chicago, it opened up his eyes to a whole lot of other issues um, that he needs to tackle. He ambitiously plans his Poor People's March in 1968. He's not going to be able to march in it because, unfortunately, April of 1968, an assassin will kill him in Memphis, Tennessee. So Ralph Abernathy is going to try to continue with that march and it highlights the problems, but doesn't necessarily translate into uh, significant legislative change here. So what we have here is the civil rights movement begins to divide, and a more militant activist voice is emerging. Different views of Black Power comes out. CORE and SNCC call for more action, so they're moving away from the nonviolence piece, and you have a self-defense group organized known as the Black Panther Party out of Oakland in California. Vietnam War also weighs in on this as well, in that Martin Luther King Jr. speaks out against it, mainly because of the disproportionate amount of African Americans who go over and fight in Vietnam, don't have a way to get out of the draft. And so he does say that many of the civil rights and the Great Society programs basically become a casualty of the Vietnam War. As a result of that, he is going to face some backlash from the white middle class because they view that this new direction is a threat to national stability. And this white middle class actually becomes a very powerful voice in the next presidential election of 1968, they're known as the silent majority here. So what you have is the civil rights movement is going to splinter and will stimulate similar efforts by other groups because they have other views that they feel are equally important and they need to be tackled on collectively by people in their own group and if there's going to be any credible change. And so in the next slides, we're going to be dealing with some of the splintering of it. In terms of individuals, Martin Luther King's main rival could be viewed as Malcolm X, and he is a member of the Nation of Islam, and then eventually he'll break away from it. But Malcolm X, if we look at his philosophy and his tactics, he is typically associated with self-defense and more militant stance. He's about cultural revival and separation. And when he is a person who gives a lot of charismatic speeches and leads to confrontation. And his appeal was to the northern urban blacks, which is something that Martin Luther King Jr. had struggled early on to try to win over to become part of this greater civil rights movement. Malcolm X had filled that void. If we look at some actions that is closely associated with Malcolm X, he gave a number of speeches, but realistically, two very important speeches focused on Black power, By Any Means Necessary, and The Ballot or the Bullet. It's about achieving equality. Same thing that Martin Luther King Jr. wanted, but its path to achieve equality is going to be more militant. By any means necessary. Just the name itself tells you. Do what you have to do to get what you're looking for. In The Ballot or the Bullet, it's like you're either going to create change through the ballot, and if it doesn't happen that way, then it's going to get violent. Once he had gone to Mecca on a pilgrimage, and he went on the pilgrimage to Mecca because he began to have different views than the Elijah Muhammad, who was head of the Nation of Islam. He goes there, and it's transformational for him. It begins to cause him to tone down a little bit of his rhetoric. And so when he comes back, his early critical nature of King's approach becomes more moderate. He is willing to become more part of the process to get that civil rights that Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking of. It's not like it's complete coming together, but it's working towards it. And as he was beginning to work towards it, he is going to be assassinated in February of 1965. And so now the strong counter voice of Martin Luther King Jr. is silenced, but there will be others that will step up in that void. Martin Luther King Jr., though, as again, to compare him to Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. is a known individual. He's been on the civil rights scene here since the early 50s. And so when we look at his philosophies, he's nonviolent, civil disobedience, direct action, more in line with, you can think of philosophers like the Mahatma Gandhi. Boycott, marches, speeches were going to be his methods. He is all about integration, not separation, and he did appeal early on to the middle class and Southern blacks. But again, when he breaks on the issue of Vietnam, and he's going to start losing some of that middle class here. When we look at some of his actions, he is all about action. He's all about confronting. Malcolm X did a great job of talking, got others to confront. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke and confronted at the same time. Montgomery bus boycott, Birmingham, March on Washington, Selma, all that shows his actions. He went to Watts, he went to Chicago. All that shows he's a person of action. And unfortunately, in April of 1968, like Malcolm X, he will be assassinated as well. So two big, powerful voices are silenced here. Now, others who could move into that militant role that Malcolm X had focused on or had spoke about, one by the name of Stokely Carmichael, and he was an advocate of Black Power. He is one of the outspoken leaders of the movement early on. He did join SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but later left the organization when he wanted to get more militant, more confrontational. He founded the Loudoun County Freedom Organization in Mississippi, and it was to deal with voting rights. He participated in the March Against Fear in Mississippi, where he famously gave his Freedom Now speech. And it was that at that moment he becomes a viable alternative to the nonviolent civil disobedience, civil rights movement methods. He championed Black Pride, Black Power. He was an advocate of self-defense, and he will continue to be that throughout the rest of the civil rights movement here. He does become associated with the Black Panther Party, and continues with advocating for the advancement of African Americans here. The Black Panther Party is going to be formed in 1966. It's a Black nationalist group formed in Oakland. They were frustrated by the failures of the civil rights movement, and especially how it reached out to urban blacks here. And one element that is associated with them is known as the 10-point program. What we want, what we believe. It was 10 points of, in many ways, spoke to some of the unfulfilled elements of that 1947-48 to secure these rights document. And so they put together this 10-point program, which gave the impression that they are a social, progressive party here, but they have that militant side to them. Successes, definitely they built on Black pride and self-esteem. They raised awareness of issues of the urban core. They implemented free breakfast and adult ed programs. However, the shortcomings was that they lacked allies because they were very militant. They had a hard time holding it together and became very divisive and disorganized. They had financial problems, so sustainability. And some of their early leaders became jailed or were killed through some of their actions here. In the Black Panther Party, one of their leaders that being jailed would be Huey Newton. For Native Americans, they continue to express their views. And how perhaps maybe in the civil rights movement their views were taking a backseat to the greater civil rights movement here. For Native Americans, the colonial era had represent a time of conquest, racism, and inferiority. During the 19th century, they experienced military defeats, the creation of the reservation system, and this push for assimilation that was actively occurring in the boarding schools. Between 1900 and 1950, citizenship was extended to Native Americans, but it was a way to Americanize them, and poverty continued to follow them into the 20th century. But an Indian New Deal law was passed, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which was giving them a little bit more autonomy. Then between 1950 and 2000, The federal government tried to get rid of some of the reservations and tribes, so we call that termination. And then organization and activism. So groups began to adopt some of the civil rights measures, and they became very active. And federal government action uh, was being advocated here to create some change. So when we look at Native Americans and what was happening during this time period, World War II will contribute to the rights consciousness being expressed by Native Americans. So there's that commonality with the civil rights movement. You did see the creation of some new organizations out there, like the National Congress of American Indians, trying to use the political process. You do have the National Indian Youth Council, so you have that youth element that wanted to begin to deal with some education issues and opportunity issues. But then you also have the formation of a militant group known as the American Indian Movement, and so if we want to look at the Minnesota connection there, the American Indian Movement starts here in Minneapolis in 1968. And they're focusing on what we'll call red power, but their big message is about sovereignty. And it's about Indian sovereignty and sovereignty that you have on the reservations and being able to determine measures for oneself, cultural awareness, all that is coming out of the American Indian Movement. So their goal is to demand reparations for broken treaties. There is a history of broken treaties between the United States government and Native Americans. Greater independence, sovereignty, I hit that home a little hard on the American Indian Movement, and address some socio-economic issues, education, health, pay, housing, crime, things that they have been experiencing ever since being put on reservations in the 19th century. Occupations, though, this is where the American Indian Movement comes into play here, to have visible reminders of their displeasure. They did take over some federal institutions or installations like at Alcatraz and the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C. They did occupy the Pine Ridge Reservation, all trying to get some of their issues addressed and having some success here. When we look at successes, overall, cultural awareness, passage of the Indian Self-Determination Education Act of 1975, again, giving more control over to Native Americans and to determine measures affecting indigenous people, getting back the Black Hills, so 7 million acres in the Black Hills, huge there. Survival schools. So not quite like Indian boarding schools, but survival schools to help build on this cultural awareness, learn language, learn history, learn their traditions and their customs and stuff like. So survival schools can be found in some urban centers like Minneapolis, but then also on the reservations as well. Shortcomings was there was divide within the American Indian community over tactics, and the reservations still that exist ultimately represent symbols of defeat here. All right, continuing here, women's movement. We can look at World War II as kind of the catalyst to get the feminist movement or the women's movement started here. In the night, a book comes out by Betty Friedan, very important book called the Feminine Mystique, and really showcases that women are more than just the caregiver at home, but women are seeking something greater, not only be a mother, but also have a career, have something that helps define them, makes them a little bit more fulfilling. So Betty Friedan is that early voice to this movement. Goals, equal rights and equal pay. Equal Rights Amendment was initiated in the 1920s, has failed. Equal pay did happen, though, under Kennedy's administration with the Equal Pay Act. That's for federal, though, not state and private, but more for federal. And just simply a greater role in society here. When we look at successes, raised awareness of unequal status, as mentioned earlier, the passage of various legislation like the Equal Pay Act. They become more politically involved. Still, though, the number of women involved in politics numbers were low, but were starting to grow. And then a landmark Supreme Court decision in 1973, Roe versus Wade, took on the issue of choice, and abortion is made legal in the United States by the Roe versus Roe versus Wade in 1973. Shortcomings is the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment, and movement becomes more fractured here. Again, it's all about tactics. It's about how far they need to go, and do they need to really have legislation to create change. And then they continue to face discrimination and workplace inequality and economic inequality here. All right. The last topic I want to focus on is youth protests, the student movement, and the counterculture. And so when we talk about youth protests, there are different strands of it. The youth movement here, one could argue, is beginning on college campuses in the 1960s. The baby boomers, they're coming of age. And you can find youth protests popping up on places like Berkeley, Columbia, Harvard, Michigan. And it's coming out of the middle class here. So part of this youth protest or these student movements, you got these different groups there. So like the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, the New Left, demanding more participatory democracy. Youth 18 to 20 couldn't vote. 21 is when you become, you have the right to vote. And so 18 to 20-year-olds feel like their voices are being silenced, as well as on campuses as well. So they're asking for more participation in the politics. The Port Huron Statement is an example of that. The free speech movement happens in Berkeley in California, where they feel that the curriculum is rather rigid. The youth need a space on campus to express their views. Initially, they were rejected. Initially, they were told to just go to class and learn, but they will succeed in being able to have a space on campus for free speech, and that will spread to other campuses as well. The youth do get involved in the civil rights movement. They participate in the freedom rides and the sit-ins. They're very active in the anti-war movement with the draft issue. That really begins to hit the highlight of why they need to be more involved in politics. 18, 20-year-olds are going off and fighting in Vietnam, but they can't pick their leaders. So the draft issue becomes very big for the youth. And the militancy here that now is beginning to be seen on campuses is causing a split and a loss of the silent majority. Silent majority, again, is that white middle class, or that middle class that looks at these individuals, these students, these youth. They're going off to colleges, they're middle class, they're coming from a privileged background, and this is the thanks being expressed. And so they're losing that support. And finally here, we're looking at the counterculture, which is in some ways, the counter to what the other youth movements are doing. They're building on the beatnik movement of the 1950s, and the message of the counterculture is just simply drop out of regular society, create a counter to the mainstream, tune in to a new way of living altogether. And so things that are associated with this counterculture, of course, is the drug side of it. But and so that's part of that hippie image. But then it's also about just being very spontaneous. It's about not following the norm. Look for alternative ways of living. Music is a big part of it. 1967, 68, or 67, excuse me, is the Summer of Love. And all coming together. It seemed to be in the epicenter of the counterculture, and that would be in San Francisco. Communes sprout up, basically this new way of living. So you can find in different places around the country these communes, and where they're coming together and they're looking at a new way of a community living together. The pitfalls, though, when we look at the counterculture movement, is that it couldn't sustain itself because of the drug use that's associated with them. You have drug abuse happening, and you have other domestic issues created as a result of that. You have a core of youth that become lost in their direction, so it's going to take some time to recover. The middle class looks at them as products of a privileged lifestyle, and you're rejecting that. And so these become some of the pitfalls of the counterculture. All right, so this concludes part 3 of the civil rights movement, and hopefully this has jogged some of your memory.